A racist police officer brazenly pointed his gun at a black woman, solely because of the color of her skin. But in the very moment her true identity was revealed, not only was the officer stunned, but the entire course of the story shifted in an instant. What truth came to light? And did justice truly prevail? Join us as we uncover this gripping tale, where shadows are illuminated and the truth is laid bare. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more shocking stories like this one. On what seemed to be an ordinary day at a small suburban supermarket, a woman faced blatant racial discrimination. But what made this story different was that the woman in question was none other than Colonel Grace Mitchell, one of the highest-ranking military officers recently returned from an extended mission. Her simple trip to the supermarket quickly escalated into a tense confrontation when she encountered a hostile and racist police officer, Stephen Parker. The situation spiraled from a minor incident into a dangerous standoff, with a gun drawn and harsh words exchanged between the two. While the surrounding crowd watched in horror, Grace remained calm and stood her ground, resolute in her pursuit of justice. This is a story of courage, composure, and a sobering reminder that racism and abuse of power persist in modern society. But it is also a story of how one woman, refusing to bow to injustice, changed everything with her strength and intellect. Follow this emotional and unexpected journey, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest moments, justice can still prevail. Colonel Grace Mitchell, a resilient woman with sharp eyes and an authoritative presence, entered the small supermarket dressed simply: a white shirt, jeans, and sneakers. Her modest appearance gave no hint that she was one of the nation's most distinguished military officers, a leader who had faced life-and-death situations and commanded hundreds of soldiers on the battlefield. Grace had just returned from a mission overseas that lasted over a year, where she had faced not only enemies on the battlefield, but also prejudice within the military ranks. As a black woman, the journey to the rank of colonel had never been easy. She had endured skeptical stares, cutting remarks, and even unfair challenges, all because of her race and gender. Yet, Grace had never let these obstacles defeat her. With talent and determination, she proved not only that she deserved her rank, but that she was among the best. Today, she wanted to take a moment for herself, to enjoy the simplicity of everyday life. For Grace, small acts like grocery shopping offered a sense of calm and normalcy after months of intense stress. With a shopping basket in hand, she strolled through the aisles, picking out essentials and savoring the peaceful ambiance of the late afternoon. But the tranquility was soon broken by an inconsiderate act at the end of the aisle. A tall man in a police uniform carelessly knocked a pack of noodles and a bottle of soda onto the floor. He glanced at the mess he had made, but, instead of picking it up, shrugged indifferently and walked away. Grace paused, her eyes fixed on the man. His behavior wasn't just irresponsible. It reflected a disregard for basic values like respect for others. For Grace, discipline and responsibility were principles she had ingrained through years of military service. She couldn't ignore such behavior, especially from someone who was supposed to set an example for the community. The man was Stephen Parker, a police officer with a smug demeanor and a disdainful gaze. Stephen was the kind of person who considered himself above the law. He had been the subject of numerous complaints for excessive force, racial bias, and abuse of power. Yet he had never faced serious consequences due to the protection of his connections within the system. Grace didn't know about Stephen's history, but his actions alone revealed his contempt for those around him. As someone who stood by her principles and wasn't afraid to speak out for justice, Grace decided to approach him and politely remind him of his responsibility. Little did she know that this small act would ignite a dramatic confrontation, a clash where dignity, courage, and justice would be tested to their limits. Grace Mitchell approached, her eyes reflecting her disapproval as she watched Stephen Parker, the man in the police uniform, casually walking away after knocking items onto the floor without even glancing back. Stephen Parker was the type of man whose arrogance and self-importance were evident to anyone who interacted with him. Tall, broad-shouldered, and perpetually exuding smugness, Stephen showed no remorse for his actions. He was a police officer with a long history of community complaints, primarily involving accusations of racism, excessive force, and abuse of power. Yet, in a system he had learned to exploit, Stephen had always avoided accountability, protected by his connections and the cover provided by his superiors. Stephen didn't believe in the concept of social responsibility. To him, the police uniform symbolized absolute authority, a badge that granted him the freedom to act as he pleased without fear of consequences. This entitlement had fostered a deep disdain for others, particularly those he deemed beneath him: women, people of color, and anyone he didn't consider worth his respect. At the supermarket that day, Stephen didn't think for a second that something as trivial as not picking up fallen items could draw any attention. To him, it was a minor issue, not worth his time. What he didn't anticipate was someone like Grace Mitchell, someone with unyielding principles and self-respect, witnessing the incident and deciding to speak up. Grace stepped closer, her tone calm but firm. "Excuse me, sir. You just dropped some items on the floor. I think it would be better if you pick them up so they don't inconvenience anyone else." Stephen stopped and turned, his cold gaze sweeping over Grace from head to toe. In his mind, she was just a dressed black woman, nothing noteworthy. With a dismissive smirk, he replied, "Who do you think you are to tell me what to do? I don't have time for trivialities like that." His tone wasn't just rude. It carried an undercurrent of deep contempt. To Stephen, Grace wasn't worth his time or consideration. Grace maintained her composure, but her eyes sharpened. As a military officer, she understood the weight of wearing a uniform and the responsibility it carried. Stephen's behavior was a stark contrast to what she believed someone representing the law should exemplify. "You're a police officer," she said, her voice steady but commanding. "You have a responsibility to set an example for the community. Picking up those items isn't just common courtesy, it shows respect for those around you." Stephen raised an eyebrow, his expression darkening. He hated being criticized, especially by a woman. Rather than acknowledge his fault, he chose to retaliate with words. "You don't need to teach me how to live my life. And who are you to lecture me? What would someone like you know about a police officer's responsibilities? My advice: mind your own business before you make a fool of yourself." Stephen's words echoed through the supermarket, drawing the attention of other shoppers. Some had already begun recording the interaction on their phones, but Stephen was unfazed. He was confident that, in his uniform, no one could touch him. Grace could feel the hostility in Stephen's tone, but she didn't back down. She recognized that this man wasn't just careless. He embodied a dangerous attitude of entitlement and abuse of power, something she had encountered many times during her military career. The tension between them escalated quickly, creating a stifling atmosphere in the supermarket. Grace stood firm, calm, but unwavering. She knew this was not just a simple confrontation, but a test of her patience and principles, and she would not allow those principles to falter. Grace stood firm, her gaze steady and her demeanor respectful, yet she refused to let Stephen Parker dismiss the issue so easily. Her reminder wasn't meant to impose, but to serve as a call to responsibility. especially for someone in a police uniform. However, instead of responding with civility, Stephen revealed his true nature, a man consumed by arrogance and a lack of respect for others. "Who do you think you are to order me around?" Stephen growled, his lips curling into a derisive smirk. His eyes scanned Grace from head to toe, as though evaluating her worth based solely on her appearance. Grace remained calm, even as Stephen's words carried an unmistakable edge of hostility. "I'm not ordering you," she said evenly. "I simply believe that as a police officer, you should lead by example, even in the smallest actions. Showing respect to the community isn't a difficult thing to do." Stephen laughed, his voice loud and mocking, echoing throughout the supermarket. A few nearby shoppers began to take notice, their curious eyes turning toward the pair. Some even pulled out their phones to record the confrontation, but Stephen seemed unfazed. If anything, he saw this as an opportunity to assert his so-called authority. "The community?" Stephen repeated, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "What does someone like you know about the community? Women like you should know their place, mind their own business, and stay out of bigger issues." His words weren't just sexist. They carried an implicit racial undertone. Though he didn't say it outright, Stephen's tone made it clear that he viewed Grace's race with disdain. Several shoppers murmured among themselves, their expressions betraying their indignation at Stephen's behavior. Grace could feel the eyes of the onlookers on her, but she didn't let it affect her composure. Facing Stephen, she maintained a firm yet respectful tone. "Sir, I don't think showing respect to others is a bigger issue. If you can't even pick up something you dropped, are you sure you're responsible enough to fulfill the duties of a police officer?" As she spoke, Grace wasn't just addressing Stephen. She was reflecting on her principles. Every time she wore her military uniform, she reminded herself that her responsibilities extended beyond her country to the values she upheld. She knew that Stephen, with his current attitude, had likely never grasped that concept. Maybe he never will, she thought, but that doesn't mean I should back down from doing the right thing. Grace's words struck a nerve. Stephen's face darkened, his smirk vanishing as anger flashed in his eyes. He stepped closer to Grace, closing the distance to just a few feet. His gaze was cold and challenging. "Who do you think you are to judge me?" Stephen hissed, his voice low but sharp. "A woman like you, a lowly black woman trying to act smart? My advice, stay quiet before you embarrass yourself in front of everyone." Stephen emphasized the last words, making it abundantly clear that his disdain wasn't just rooted in sexism, but also racism. His remarks sent a wave of tension through the supermarket. Some shoppers stepped back, watching the confrontation with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Grace felt anger rise within her, but years of military training had taught her how to control her emotions. On the battlefield, she had learned that composure was the strongest weapon. She stared directly at Stephen, her sharp gaze cutting through his arrogance. "Sir, I don't care what you think of me, but I will say this. If you continue to act this way, you'll only destroy your image and the integrity of the uniform you're wearing." Stephen laughed loudly, but his laugh was tinged with growing frustration. "Destroy my image? Don't make me laugh. I'm a police officer. I don't need advice from someone as insignificant as you. My advice to you is to stay silent and leave before people start laughing at you." Stephen assumed his words would make Grace back down, but he was wrong. She was not someone who could be intimidated or overpowered by displays of authority. Grace could feel the injustice radiating from the situation, and she knew that this time silence wasn't an option. The shoppers around them continued to watch, phones still recording every moment. The confrontation between Grace and Stephen had become the center of attention, and, whether he liked it or not, Stephen had become the subject of public judgment. Yet, instead of recognizing his mistake, he only grew more aggressive, and it was this attitude that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The atmosphere in the supermarket grew taut, like a stretched wire, as Stephen Parker took another step toward Grace Mitchell, his voice growing sharper and more menacing. Seemingly emboldened by the authority of his police uniform, Stephen leaned closer to Grace, his tone low but brimming with aggression. "I'm warning you for the last time. Keep quiet and stay out of my business. If you don't, I'll make you regret ever crossing me," he snarled, his cold eyes fixed on hers. Grace stood her ground, unfazed by the threat. She knew her firmness might provoke Stephen further, but she wasn't someone who would be intimidated by a bully in a position of power. Meeting Stephen's gaze head-on, she replied in a calm yet weighty voice, every word carrying the strength of her conviction. "Sir," she said, her eyes steady, "behavior like this is unbecoming of someone who represents the law. You're not only eroding the community's trust, but also tarnishing your image. I suggest you think carefully before you continue." Grace's words were like fuel poured onto Stephen's already bruised ego. His fists clenched tightly, his face reddening with anger. Stephen wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he viewed with disdain deep in his psyche. The crowd around them began to grow, their eyes a mixture of curiosity and concern. Some quietly stepped back to avoid getting involved, while others couldn't look away. Phones were raised, capturing every moment of the confrontation. Whispers rippled through the supermarket, but Stephen paid no attention. All his focus was on Grace. "Who do you think you are?" Stephen spat, emphasizing each word with contempt. "You're just a lowly black woman who doesn't know her place in society. Let me give you some advice. Walk away now before I make things worse for you." Stephen's words were laced with clear racial and gender bias. Though unspoken, the disdain in his voice was unmistakable, and the crowd around them felt the weight of his prejudice. Murmurs turned into audible disapproval, and some shoppers exchanged looks of indignation. Grace sensed the tension in the air, but refused to let it disturb her calm. She had faced far graver situations on the battlefield. Stephen, regardless of his police uniform, was just another obstacle to overcome. "I'm not here to argue with you," Grace said, her tone composed yet firm. "But if you think your power can silence others, you're mistaken. I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not afraid to stand up for what's right." While her words carried authority, Grace's mind wandered briefly to her early days in the military, where she had endured snide remarks and skeptical stares for being both a woman and a person of color. "Stephen is just one of many like that," she thought, "but I've overcome worse to stand here today. Nothing, not even his threats, will make me falter." Grace's response hit Stephen like a slap to his fragile ego. He ground his teeth, trying to maintain composure, but the anger bubbling inside was evident. The crowd continued to swell, their murmurs now turning into murmurs of support for Grace. Some began voicing their approval, while others remained frozen, unsure of how to intervene. Stephen, realizing he was becoming the center of attention, tried to reassert his dominance. Pointing a finger at Grace, he raised his voice, his tone thick with intimidation. "You don't know who you're dealing with, do you?" Stephen growled. "I'm a police officer. I enforce the law. And if you don't respect that, I can arrest you right here and now. You want to try me?" Stephen's words made the air in the supermarket heavy with tension. A few customers stepped back, fearing the situation might escalate into something worse. But Grace, with the composure and experience of a seasoned military officer, remained unshaken. She stared directly into Stephen's eyes, her gaze unwavering. "Sir, if you think power means abusing others, then you don't deserve to wear that uniform," Grace said, her words deliberate and resolute. Her statement silenced the crowd. Stephen froze as if struck by a heavy blow. But, rather than back down, he decided to escalate the situation further, pushing it to a level of danger even he couldn't foresee. Stephen stood there, his chest heaving with anger, his eyes blazing with hostility that he no longer tried to conceal. For a brief moment, his smug expression twisted into bitterness. His voice, cold and heavy, carried the weight of deeply ingrained prejudice. "Who do you think you are, standing here acting all noble?" Stephen sneered, his tone dripping with mockery. "People like you, always thinking you deserve more than you're worth. You don't understand your true place in society. Let me remind you, you can try to climb all you want, but in the end, you'll always just be you." Stephen's words weren't just a personal attack, they were a reflection of the deep-seated prejudices he had harbored for years. He couldn't fathom that someone like Grace, a black woman, could achieve true success. To Stephen, high positions in society were reserved for people like him, a belief nurtured by the biased environment and flawed values he had grown up with. The crowd around them began to grasp the true nature of Stephen. He wasn't just a rude police officer. He was the product of a biased system that had shielded and enabled him for years. Despite numerous complaints from the community about his excessive force, racism, and abuse of power, Stephen had never faced real consequences. Whenever complaints were filed, Stephen's superiors brushed them aside, justifying his behavior by labeling him a dedicated and well-trained officer. He had grown accustomed to escaping accountability, which only fueled his arrogance further. To Stephen, his police badge wasn't a symbol of justice, but a shield that allowed him to act with impunity. Deep down, Stephen carried a simmering resentment. He loathed seeing people he considered inferior achieve success or rise to prominent positions. This explained his particularly venomous attitude toward Grace. He knew nothing about her, but her calm demeanor and the authority in her responses made him feel threatened. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" Stephen continued, his voice rising as he tried to drown out the murmurs of the crowd. "People like you shouldn't think you're special. You'll never understand the burden people like me carry to keep order in this society." Grace said nothing, but her sharp gaze remained fixed on Stephen. She wasn't just looking at him, she was seeing through him. A man warped by arrogance and flawed values, desperately trying to protect his image by tearing others down. Stephen pressed on. "You have no idea how the world works. People like me, we're the ones who keep this society from falling into chaos. And you? You're just someone trying to stand out in a world where you don't belong." Stephen's words hung in the tense air of the supermarket, but rather than shaking Grace, they only steeled her resolve. She had heard similar rhetoric before, from those who doubted her worth, who believed she didn't deserve the position she had, worked so hard to achieve. Yet it was precisely these prejudices that had made Grace stronger, more determined to prove that no one had the right to define another's value. Stephen was oblivious to the fact that with every word he was exposing his true nature to the crowd, a man drunk on power, riddled with prejudice, and devoid of responsibility. While he thought he was intimidating Grace, he was unwittingly placing himself in an inescapable spotlight. Stephen's words, brimming with hatred and arrogance, filled the supermarket like a suffocating fog. A tense silence engulfed the crowd as his final words hung in the air. a blatant challenge directed at Grace. But Grace Mitchell, steadfast in her resolve, remained unmoved. She didn't need flowery rhetoric to respond. Her upright posture, piercing gaze, and calm demeanor spoke volumes. Stephen, agitated by Grace's refusal to back down, couldn't hide the growing fury within him. To him, every second she stood there without retreating felt like a slap to his already fragile ego. In a moment of unrestrained anger, Stephen did the unthinkable. He drew his gun from the holster at his side, the cold barrel aimed squarely at Grace. "Leave now," Stephen bellowed, his voice sharp with menace. "I won't say it again." Chaos erupted. Shouts echoed through the supermarket as customers screamed and scattered. Some ran toward the exits in a panic, while others crouched behind shelves for cover. No one could believe a minor confrontation had escalated to this point. Phones that had been recording the exchange now trembled in the hands of their frightened owners. Amid the chaos, Grace Mitchell stood still. Her stance was firm, unyielding, like a rock amid a raging torrent. Her eyes never left Stephen, not out of fear, but with focus and determination. As a military colonel, Grace had faced far greater dangers than this. Stephen wasn't the first adversary to aim a weapon at her, and she knew he wouldn't be the last. The moment Stephen pulled his gun and aimed it at her, Grace felt the tension in the air thicken. Her heart pounded, not out of fear, but because she knew this situation transcended a personal conflict. Years on the battlefield had taught her that in the most dangerous moments, only calm and focus could prevail. As her gaze flicked to the terrified faces around her, she reminded herself, "They're counting on me. I can't let anger or fear cloud my judgment." "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life," Grace said, her voice steady, but laced with the authority of someone accustomed to staring down danger. "Think carefully before you take another step, because your actions now will define the rest of your life." Stephen's hands tightened around the gun, and he began to feel the weight of the situation he had created. Beads of sweat rolled down his forehead, yet his eyes still burned with defiance. He couldn't bring himself to admit that Grace had seized the upper hand, not just with her words, but with her unshakable poise and authority. Grace noticed the slight tremor in Stephen's grip. She knew this was a critical moment. She made no sudden moves, doing nothing that might escalate the situation further. Instead, she spoke again, her voice clear and deliberate. "You're letting your anger control you," she said, "and that will destroy you. This is not how a police officer behaves. This is not how any decent person behaves." Stephen didn't respond, but the gun in his hand remained raised. The worried murmurs of the crowd had gone silent. No one dared move. Every eye was fixed on the two of them. Grace realized that this wasn't just Stephen's test. It was hers as well. She wasn't merely confronting an abusive officer. She was being watched by everyone, their hopes pinned on how she would handle this moment. "You can shoot me if you want," Grace continued, her voice unwavering. "But if you do, you'll lose more than that badge. You'll lose your freedom. This is your last chance to make it right. Put the gun down." Stephen hesitated. He knew Grace was right. Everything he was doing was being recorded, every word, every movement. But his ego, fueled by anger, kept him from backing down. He wanted to win, but he didn't know how to deal with someone like Grace, a person who couldn't be intimidated by his authority or threats. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Stephen roared, but this time his voice lacked the confidence it had before. Grace didn't flinch. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Stephen Parker. Someone who's abusing his power and walking down a path with no way out." Each of Grace's words was like a direct blow to Stephen's bloated arrogance. The crowd remained frozen, holding their breath. Though Stephen hadn't lowered his gun, the slight shake in his hands betrayed the internal battle he was losing. This was no longer just a standoff. It was a battle of wills, and it was clear that Grace's resolve was winning. The tension in the supermarket continued to escalate as Stephen Parker, his gun still trained on Grace Mitchell, clung desperately to what remained of his authority. But before the situation could spiral completely out of control, another voice rang out from behind. "Stop this, right now!" From the corner of the supermarket, an older man with a commanding presence emerged from the crowd. Dressed simply, yet exuding confidence and resolve, he immediately drew everyone's attention. It was Robert Harris, a retired veteran who had served in the military for decades, and now lived quietly in the area. By chance, he had been in the supermarket and couldn't stand idly by as the situation unfolded before him. "What are you doing?" Robert asked, his voice steady and powerful, carrying the weight of a man who had faced countless dangers. "Pointing a gun at an unarmed woman? Aren't you ashamed? This is not how someone wearing a police uniform should act." Stephen turned toward Robert, his eyes burning with anger. The challenge posed by the older man only fueled his aggression. "Stay out of this," Stephen yelled, his gun unwavering. "This doesn't concern you. Leave now." But Robert didn't back down. With the composure of a seasoned soldier, he knew this situation required calm and tact. He took a step forward, his tone softening as he tried to de-escalate the conflict. "Young man, think this through. Lower the gun and talk like men. You don't have to take it this far. Believe me, I've seen too many people make the wrong choice and pay the price. Don't be the next one." Stephen hesitated briefly, but his wounded pride wouldn't let him heed the advice. He took a step back, his voice growing harsher and more defensive. "I don't need anyone telling me what to do. I'm a cop. I am the law here. If you don't want trouble, back off now." With that, Stephen shoved Robert, causing him to stumble back a few steps. Stephen's aggression had reached its peak, and it revealed his true nature. A man spiraling out of control, consumed by anger and an inflated ego. While Stephen's attention was on Robert, Grace saw her chance to act. Moving deliberately, she retrieved her phone from her pocket, her hands steadied despite the tense situation. She quickly dialed a familiar number, that of Mayor William Edwards, a longtime friend and a leader known for his fairness and decisiveness. The call connected, and within seconds the mayor's deep, authoritative voice came through on the other end. "Colonel Mitchell, what's going on?" "Mr. Mayor," Grace replied, her tone calm despite the charged atmosphere. "I'm at the supermarket near the town center. There's a serious situation involving a police officer. I need you to come here immediately." "Understood," the mayor responded without hesitation. "I'm on my way. Don't take any unnecessary risks. I trust you'll handle things until I arrive." Grace closed the phone, her gaze fixed on Stephen, who had turned back toward her after pushing Robert. Though the situation remained fraught with danger, Grace knew help was on its way. For now, her duty was to prevent the situation from escalating further. "Stephen," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "I've contacted the mayor. He's on his way here, and when he arrives you'll have to answer, not just to me, but to this entire community for your actions. This is your last chance to lower the gun and do the right thing." Stephen faltered for a moment, his expression shifting from rage to fleeting uncertainty. But his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. "The mayor?" he scoffed, letting out a short, mocking laugh. "You think I'm scared of the mayor? I don't care about him or anyone else. You should worry about yourself instead." Stephen's words, filled with defiance, no longer had the intended effect on Grace. She remained steadfast, a symbol of unyielding resolve and integrity, knowing that time was now on her side. While Stephen sank deeper into his anger, Grace held her ground, because she knew justice was on its way. The tension in the supermarket was palpable as all eyes remained fixed on Stephen Parker and Grace Mitchell. Just minutes after Grace's call, the wail of sirens pierced the air outside, drawing the crowd's attention. A sleek black car pulled up to the entrance, and Mayor William Edwards stepped out, flanked by 2 bodyguards and a group of senior officers. William Edwards was a tall man with the composed demeanor of a seasoned leader accustomed to handling crises. He strode briskly into the supermarket, his sharp eyes surveying the scene before settling on Grace and Stephen. His presence seemed to shift the atmosphere, stirring the heavy air of anxiety. "Colonel Mitchell," he said, his voice both formal and warm. "Are you all right?" The entire supermarket seemed to hold its breath. The words Colonel Mitchell echoed like a revelation, leaving the crowd, and especially Stephen Parker, stunned. Whispers spread rapidly among the bystanders. "Colonel? She's a colonel?" This unexpected truth hit like lightning, instantly altering the dynamics of the situation. Grace nodded, her gaze steady. "I'm fine, Mr. Mayor, but this situation needs to be resolved immediately." Mayor Edwards turned his sharp gaze to Stephen, who was still clutching his firearm. Stephen's hand trembled slightly, and his face was taut with tension. The arrival of the mayor and the senior officers had thrown him off balance. "Who do you think you are to criticize me?" Stephen stammered, his voice losing its usual bravado. The mayor didn't give him a chance to continue. "I'm William Edwards, the mayor of this city, and I'm witnessing one of my police officers engaging in gross misconduct. Officer Parker, what do you think you're doing?" Stephen, now facing mounting pressure from both the mayor and the crowd, attempted to defend himself. Desperation seeped into his voice as he scrambled to shift the narrative. "Mr. Mayor," Stephen began, his tone hurried, "this isn't what it looks like. This woman," he pointed at Grace, "provoked me from the start. She insulted me and deliberately escalated the situation. I was just following protocol to maintain order." Stephen's attempt at composure was met with murmurs of disapproval from the crowd. A few people shook their heads, but Stephen continued with an air of forced confidence, as though he believed he had successfully redirected attention. "This woman has no respect for the law, Mr. Mayor. I was just doing what I thought was right in this situation," he added, hoping to garner support. At that moment, a middle-aged man stepped forward from the crowd, holding up his phone. His voice was firm and clear. "Mr. Mayor, I recorded the entire incident. Everyone here saw exactly who provoked whom." The man raised his phone, playing the video for one of the senior officers. The footage revealed the entire sequence of events: Stephen dropping items, his disrespectful comments toward Grace, and finally, his act of pulling a gun on her. As the video played for Mayor Edwards and the officers, Stephen's demeanor shifted. The false confidence drained from his face, replaced by a look of fear and confusion. The crowd around them began to murmur with indignation, and some even shouted in protest against Stephen's behavior. "What do you have to say for yourself, Officer Parker?" Mayor Edwards asked, his tone icy. "The evidence speaks louder than your feeble excuses." Stephen, now devoid of any defense, hung his head in silence. His final words before being handcuffed were a faint, trembling whisper. I didn't mean to." Mayor Edwards turned to him, his voice growing colder. "You pulled a gun on an unarmed woman, and not just any woman, but Colonel Grace Mitchell, one of the most distinguished and respected military officers in our nation. Do you understand the gravity of that?" A stunned silence enveloped the supermarket. The revelation of Grace's identity spread like wildfire, leaving everyone awestruck. The once dismissive glances toward her turned into looks of deep respect, while Stephen stood frozen, his face pale with disbelief. He couldn't comprehend that the woman he had insulted and threatened held such a prestigious position. One of the senior officers accompanying the mayor stepped forward and said, "Mr. Mayor, we've reviewed some of the footage from the witnesses. Officer Parker's actions here not only violate police conduct, but constitute a criminal offense." William Edwards nodded, his gaze still locked on Stephen. "Parker, lower your weapon immediately. That is a direct order." Stephen hesitated, his hand gripping the gun tightly as if it were his last vestige of authority. But the mayor's piercing stare and the presence of the senior officers left him with no choice. After a few tense seconds, Stephen reluctantly lowered the gun. One of the officers stepped forward cautiously and confiscated the weapon. The mayor took a step closer to Stephen, his voice cutting like steel. "Officer Parker, your behavior today has not only disgraced the uniform you wear, but also brought shame to this police force. You are hereby suspended from duty effective immediately and will face a full investigation." The mayor's words fell like a gavel, leaving no room for argument. Stephen, now stripped of any defense, stood in silent humiliation. The crowd erupted into applause, a collective release of the tension that had gripped them, and a show of admiration for Grace Mitchell's courage and resolve. Grace approached the mayor, her expression calm yet resolute. "Thank you for arriving so quickly, Mr. Mayor," she said. William offered a slight smile, though his tone remained serious. "No, it is you who deserves thanks, Colonel Mitchell. You handled this situation with a level of composure and bravery that few could muster. But I think we can all agree. Our system needs significant reform to prevent incidents like this from ever happening again." Grace nodded, understanding that what had just transpired was more than a personal confrontation. It was a stark reminder of the need for accountability and justice in society. She knew that while this chapter had closed, the larger battle for systemic change was far from over. The tension in the supermarket seemed to ease slightly after Stephen Parker's gun was confiscated, but all eyes remained fixed on the unfolding events. The arrival of Mayor William Edwards had temporarily calmed the situation, but what Stephen had just done could not be ignored. A customer, who had been silently observing the incident, stepped forward. She was a young woman with a determined look in her eyes, holding up a phone that was still recording. "Mr. Mayor," she said, her voice steady but with a slight tremor, "I recorded the entire incident. If you'd like, I can provide it as evidence." The mayor nodded, his face stern but appreciative. "Thank you. We will need that video to ensure justice is served." The woman handed her phone to one of the senior officers. The video was immediately played back on the phone's screen. The noise in the supermarket died down as everyone focused intently on the footage, showing Stephen dropping items, his rude and prejudiced remarks toward Grace, and the climactic moment when he drew his gun to threaten her. When the video ended, Mayor Edwards' expression hardened further. He turned to Stephen, his voice calm yet piercing. "Officer Parker, this video depicts your actions, from abusing your power and insulting a citizen to the reckless and unacceptable act of threatening an innocent life. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Stephen, now pale-faced, struggled to regain his composure. He stammered, "Mr. Mayor, this was all just a misunderstanding. That woman, she provoked me. I was only trying to maintain order. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." But his feeble excuses could not obscure the undeniable truth captured on video. The crowd, both those who witnessed the event firsthand and those watching through the phone, looked at Stephen with a mix of disdain and outrage. Mayor Edwards remained unmoved. "Officer Parker, I've seen enough. Your behavior violates not only the values every police officer is sworn to uphold, but also the law itself. Instead of protecting this community, you endangered it." Stephen tried to interject, his voice desperate. "Mr. Mayor, I didn't mean... I just lost control for a moment." But his words carried no weight. Mayor Edwards turned to the senior officers and issued a firm order. "Take him into custody immediately. Officer Parker is suspended from duty effective immediately and will face a full investigation." Two officers stepped forward and handcuffed Stephen in full view of the crowd. His head hung low, the arrogance and self-assuredness he had displayed earlier completely gone. Now he was just a defeated man, standing amidst the disdainful gazes of those around him. As Stephen was led away, the crowd erupted into applause, not just as a celebration of justice, but as an acknowledgment of Grace Mitchell's courage and steadfastness. The mayor turned to Grace, his expression softening with genuine respect. "Colonel Mitchell, I owe you my deepest thanks. Without your resolve and bravery, this situation could have ended in tragedy. You exemplify what this society needs: calm, integrity, and determination." Grace nodded humbly and replied, "Thank you, Mr. Mayor, but I hope this incident serves as a powerful reminder that we need reform and a stronger system, one where power isn't abused and justice is always upheld." Mayor Edwards smiled, a look of determination on his face. "I promise you, this won't end here. We will continue to fight for improvement." The story of Stephen Parker concluded not only as the downfall of an individual, but as a significant lesson about responsibility and power. Meanwhile, Grace Mitchell, through her calm and courage, once again proved that justice can prevail, even in the most challenging circumstances. Stephen Parker, with his hands cuffed and his face pale, was escorted out of the supermarket by two senior officers. He stumbled as he walked, his eyes darting around as though searching for a sliver of hope. In Stephen's mind, everything seemed to be collapsing. The image he had of himself, a confident officer who believed he stood above the law, was now reduced to that of a despised figure. "This can't be happening. I'm Stephen Parker," he told himself, but the voice in his mind lacked conviction. Memories of times when he had escaped accountability thanks to his connections flooded back, but this time things were different. The surrounding crowd was no longer silent. Phones captured his every step, and the gaze of the onlookers, filled with a mix of outrage and contempt, pierced through his already fractured sense of pride. Stephen felt his chest tighten. "Have I gone too far?" a small voice whispered in his mind, but it was quickly drowned out by his inflated ego. "No, I'm just being misunderstood. This isn't my fault." Yet the trembling in his cuffed hands and the cold sweat trickling down his temple betrayed his facade of confidence. As Stephen passed through the crowd, the murmurs of those around him echoed in his head. Every criticism felt like a dagger, carving deeper into his already shattered self-esteem. Mayor William Edwards, his face stern, stepped forward in front of the crowd. His voice rang out, firm and resolute, like a declaration of justice. As Grace watched Stephen being led away in cuffs, she didn't feel satisfaction or triumph. Instead, a familiar sense of unease settled over her. This isn't the end, she thought. Today is just one small step in the longer battle to fix a broken system. She knew Stephen's arrest was a positive signal, but the real challenge lay in implementing profound changes to prevent such abuses of power from happening again. Stephen Parker has been arrested on the spot for abusing his power, threatening the life of an innocent citizen and committing serious violations of police conduct. I have ordered his immediate suspension, and a thorough investigation will be conducted to uncover the full scope of this incident," Mayor Edwards announced, his voice steady and authoritative. The crowd collectively exhaled, a sign of relief. But William didn't stop there. He turned to one of the officers standing nearby and continued in an even graver tone. "I want to make it clear that this is not the first incident involving Stephen Parker. For years, we've received complaints about his rude behavior, discriminatory actions, and abuse of power. Yet the system has failed to address these violations appropriately." The crowd began murmuring. Some expressed surprise, while others nodded knowingly, as though they had long suspected this. A woman in the crowd shouted, "Finally! Someone is doing something about him. We've endured enough." William Edwards raised his hand, signaling for silence. "What happened today is the tipping point. I pledge to ensure that not only will Stephen Parker be held accountable, but the entire system will be scrutinized to root out anyone who abuses their power. We do not need individuals like him in our police force." The mayor's declaration was met with applause from the crowd. It wasn't just a recognition of his decision, but also an acknowledgement that, at last, justice was being served. Meanwhile, Grace Mitchell quietly observed the scene. She didn't clap or speak, but her eyes reflected a sense of satisfaction and relief. Not because Stephen Parker had been arrested, but because this proved that, no matter how difficult, it was possible to fight for what was right. An officer approached Grace and the mayor, handing William a file. "Mr. Mayor, this is Stephen Parker's record. Numerous violations have been documented over the years, but they were dismissed due to lack of evidence or pressure from those protecting him." William flipped through the pages, his expression growing increasingly grave. He looked up at Grace, his eyes filled with respect. "Colonel Mitchell, I don't know how to adequately express my gratitude. Without your courage and resolve, we might have allowed Stephen Parker to continue harming this community." Grace responded calmly. "Justice isn't something that comes easily, Mr. Mayor, but with patience and determination, we can create change. I only hope this serves as motivation to build a better system." William nodded. "I promise you, we will do everything we can to make improvements." As Stephen was led away, Grace's gaze followed him. She didn't look at him with resentment or disdain, but with a calm demeanor, like someone closing a chapter in a much larger struggle she was prepared to continue. The crowd began to disperse, but this story was far from over. It had already spread across the community, becoming a symbol of the fight against abuse of power and injustice. Stephen Parker, once proud of the police badge he wore on his chest, was now a stark reminder that power must always be wielded with responsibility. As Stephen Parker was escorted away, the supermarket gradually returned to its usual quiet. However, the events of that day would not easily be forgotten. Mayor William Edwards, still standing among the crowd, turned to face Grace Mitchell. His eyes conveyed both gratitude and respect, not just as a leader, but as a fellow citizen. "Colonel Mitchell," he began, his voice formal yet sincere, "on behalf of the city and everyone present here, I want to offer my deepest apologies. No one should have to endure what you did today, especially from someone whose duty is to protect the citizens." Grace, maintaining her composed demeanor, responded with a slight nod. "Thank you, Mr. Mayor. But more important than apologies are actions. I hope today's incident doesn't end with addressing one individual, but serves as a wake-up call for us to reform the system." Mayor Edwards nodded, determination shining in his eyes. "I pledge to you and everyone here that we will begin immediately. There will be no place for those who abuse power in our police force or any institution representing justice. We will work to rebuild the trust that this community has placed in us." His words were met with applause from the surrounding crowd. This incident was not just a personal lesson, but a catalyst for broader change. Grace wasn't seeking praise or recognition. She simply wanted the right thing to be done, and today she had fulfilled her duty, not just as a soldier, but as a citizen standing up for what was right. Once everything settled down, she quietly left the supermarket, leaving behind a crowd still buzzing with discussions about what they had witnessed. The next day, Grace returned to her work at the base. As she walked through the gates, her stride was as strong and confident as ever. Her colleagues, having heard about what happened at the supermarket, awaited her with quiet admiration. When she entered the training grounds, a crisp salute rang out, not just because of her rank, but out of respect for her unyielding spirit. A former comrade, someone who had faced danger alongside her on the battlefield, approached her with a meaningful handshake. "We've heard about what you did," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You're not just an exceptional commander, but an inspiration to all of us." Grace gave a slight smile, her eyes as sharp as ever. Justice isn't always easy, but it's worth fighting for, and this fight is far from over. We're not just soldiers on a battlefield, we're defenders of the values we stand for. Her words resonated in the still air, a reminder that their work, not just wielding weapons but safeguarding humanity's core values, would never cease. The story concluded with Grace Mitchell stepping into her command office, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows, a symbol of hope and unyielding resolve. Though the battle against injustice was far from over, she knew that she and others like her would always rise to defend justice, no matter the circumstances. The story of Colonel Grace Mitchell is not only a lesson in courage and perseverance in the face of injustice, but also a powerful reminder that justice is not automatic. It requires struggle and the voices of those willing to stand up. Through this event, can we come together to build a society where power is used responsibly and everyone is treated fairly? What do you think of Grace's bravery and her handling of such a challenging situation? If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like the video, share it with friends and family, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.